Welcome to the Gender in Focus podcast. I'm Elle, and each week I get to ask Kai Scott, the president of Transfocus Consulting, all the questions you have ever wanted to ask about trans and non-binary people in the workplace and in the wider world.
If somebody is a leader or a manager of somebody, then the asking of questions of the team member or the person that reports to you, that becomes even more tricky because then sometimes people feel like they have to answer in order to continue to be gainfully employed, which that's an awful position to be in.
I feel like that it's one of those things that where I don't know, I have probably thought every single one of those questions at some point in my life. And I feel like you're allowed to think it, you're allowed to have the questions and you are allowed to seek out answers. It's just knowing where to do that and how to do that and with whom.
So what's your real name? Have you had the surgery? Who do you date? At work, some questions pop into people's heads and somehow straight out of their mouths. In today's episode, we're unpacking why curiosity isn't neutral, how power dynamics change what feels, quote, optional, and why not every thought needs to be shared out loud. We'll talk about boundaries, intent versus impact, and how to ask questions in a respectful way when somebody does want to share. Elle, let's start with this. Just because you want to know something, does that mean you're entitled to ask?
It's a good question. I feel like if you were going to ask me a question like that, you have to be okay with the fact that I might not respond well to it in general. I'm also pretty sure that you've been on the receiving end of those kinds of questions a lot. I would imagine that's my assumption. And I guess that's a pretty good place to start with. What other kinds of questions in general do trans people get asked?
I mean, there's so many different questions. In fact, questions kind of is a bit of one of the lead things that are challenging for trans and non-binary folks at work, just because it comes up so often. I think some of it stems from an understandable lack of information about trans and non-binary people generally. And so when a cisgender person, somebody who wants to be an ally, suddenly has a trans person right in front of them, it's like, finally, all of these things that I've ever wondered are coming to the forefront, and maybe even duking it out in somebody's mind of like, okay, which one do I ask first? And, people are excited. They're maybe a bit nervous. There's a combination of feelings that come up for folks, or the way that they describe it to us when we work with them. And so the things that I've mentioned at the outset are very common ones around, what's your real name? People are really focused on gender affirming care, or what used to be called sex reassignment surgery. So all the medical aspects of transition.
Right.
People want to know about bodies because for many, gender is located in the body. And so, and it is for trans folks too, to some degree. But that's not always the biggest focus for everybody. And so that's where it gets a bit challenging. And of course, bodies are private as well. Or just even medical procedures in general have a privacy to them. We don't kind of ask, people's status in terms of whether they have cancer or not, or, all kinds of numbers of things when it comes to medical pieces of information. There's political discourse that can come up where it's like, what about this topic that's kind of hot and polarized? So people want to debate trans women in sport, for example. People are curious about how people have sex, and you'd think that people might think twice about asking that at work, but that's not the case. In my experience, I've had people point blank ask me, and I'm like, wow, okay.
Like 20 minutes left on my lunch break. Don't know if I want to talk about this.
Let's get into it. Like, okay. There's also folks who are curious about non-binary identities because, again, there's just a complete lack of information. And some people just didn't know that there were more genders beyond men and women or boys and girls. And so there's just so much that kind of it can be rapid fire sometimes, in a situation. So yeah, those are some of the things at play among many others.
I want to talk about just like the difference between asking questions that you're curious about, maybe outside of work,
Mm,
versus asking certain questions within work, and why there is like maybe a bit more sensitivity. Well, I mean, there's always sensitivity, but just like, especially in a workplace, you can't be just asking somebody how they have sex, presumably.
right.
So I know it probably seems a bit obvious, but I was wondering if you could go into that a little bit more.
Right. Yes. So in general, we have the sense in North America, and maybe in other cultures it's a bit different, but certainly within the North American context, there is this kind of separation of personal and professional lives. And
Hmm.
so at work, we kind of keep a certain degree of professionalism, whether it's we don't talk much about our personal lives beyond certain key topics, and the rest we keep in our personal lives. And
Hmm.
when it comes to things related to, as I was mentioning, the kind of medical care that somebody receives can tend to be off topic if brought up in the workplace. Uh, there are also just things that we are maybe a little bit more reticent to talk about, especially when it comes to our past, especially
Hmm.
if it's a difficult past that can
Yeah.
also be difficult to bring up and discuss in the workplace, because it comes with emotional reactions. And I think there is a place for emotion within the workplace. So it's not
Hmm.
meant to say that we should not ever talk about these, but it's just with a certain sensitivity because somebody is trying to do their work, right? That's the
Right.
main
Yeah.
focus, to complete tasks or connect with people or whatnot. Certainly, having some understanding of somebody's experience can help create connections in the workplace.
Mm.
So it's never completely off topic, but it's just thinking it through a little bit more because for many trans and non-binary folks, there is a lot of excitement, but there's also a lot of difficulty associated with being trans in this society currently.
I feel like a lot of the time, well, at least definitely my experience of this, and I'm sure you've had similar experiences, but
Mm,
it's sort of talked about like it's just like an interesting topic, like, oh, you're here now, I can ask you lots of questions. And there is that kind of, like you were saying, the more maybe difficult stuff or just really personal, and it's a fun topic for you, but it's a very deeply personal topic
mm-hmm.
for me or for whoever it is. And
Yeah.
there can be people can forget that, and it's not treated with the sensitivity that maybe it deserves or needs. And that can be pretty difficult as well at work when you're like trying to also balance, like, okay, I kind of need to be on my game a little bit, or I need
Mhm.
to have my mind on my job and not
Right.
panicking about what next question you're going to ask me.
Mm,
And so I kind of wanted to go in from there to look at the way this differs between relationships, because I've had somebody quite recently who I barely know at all ask
mm,
me quite a personal question, which
mm,
lands very differently to if you asked me that same question.
mm,
And
mhm.
so, but I actually work with you. So it's not strictly about
Right.
work more than it is about understanding kind of where you fall in each other's lives. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very good point. There's kind of two dimensions that I want to point out. One, how close one is to the coworker or the
Hmm.
colleague. Is this more of a distant acquaintance within the team or beyond? Or is this something you've gotten to know over the course? Maybe you go to lunch, maybe you go to activities outside of work, right?
Hmm.
So there can be a bit of blending of personal and professional. So, and that's not super surprising because we spend a lot of
Right.
time with folks at work. So that's okay. In which case, there's probably a little bit more space to get into some of these, perhaps a little bit more personal side of the equation questions. But
Hmm.
of course, you still want to proceed with caution and with sensitivity and always letting the folks know that they don't need to respond, right? Which
Hmm.
they generally do know that, but it's
Yeah.
good for you to signal that you know that too, right? Because otherwise it can border on insistence, which is a
Mm.
very dangerous, well, not dangerous, but harmful dynamic, even if it's not
Mm.
intended. Sometimes the urgency with somebody asks a question can feel like a lot on the other end, and then having to manage that. And
Right.
yeah, so there's the whole dynamic that you want to be cautious of. But if you don't really know somebody that well, it's really important not to get into all of these personal questions. Sometimes people think they need to know this information. Often we hear from allies that they think that they need to know gender in order to know pronouns, but actually you can
Right.
just shortcut to the pronouns. You don't need to go through gender if you know what I mean.
Right. Yeah.
It's more like you just ask pronouns and then you're off to the races, right? So
Mhm.
it's just unpacking some of those misconceptions that people want to be respectful, they don't know how, and so they might be asking more than they really need, and to prioritize the practical stuff rather than the identity pieces. And if somebody wants to share, they will, in which case, then you have the information without insisting or prompting for it necessarily. The other part of the equation, the second part, is if there is a power imbalance, or not imbalance, but dynamic, where if somebody is a leader or a manager of somebody, then the asking of questions of the team member or the person that reports to you, that
Mhm.
becomes even more tricky because then sometimes people feel like they have to answer in order to be
Right.
continue to be gainfully employed, which that's an awful position to be in. And
Mhm.
sometimes managers are thinking, again, similar to what I just said, thinking that they need to know information, what surgery somebody is going to have, when actually they just
Right.
need to know what time, how much time do they need off. It's a practical exercise of figuring out, okay, without getting into details around the surgery, like what do you need to know? Oh, okay, you're going to need 6 weeks off. Let's schedule that
Mhm.
and work together. So it's just, thinking through what you need to know and why. And if it's just
Yeah.
like personal curiosity, it should be within the context of a closer relationship. Uh,
Mhm.
and then just being careful as a leader, talking to somebody that reports to you.
So I kind of want to touch on something that you were just talking about around insistence,
Hmm.
and I kind of want you to go into that a bit more, because sometimes I think people don't realize that they are even being insistent when they're just trying to get that information, or they think they need that information. But um, it can, like, that curiosity, or yeah, that insistence can be pretty stressful to be on the receiving end of.
Mhm.
So I was hoping you could go into that
Yeah.
in more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. So insistence, you're right that most people may not understand it as insistence. What
Hmm.
tends to happen, what we hear from folks who are allies, who are aspiring allies and well along their way allies, is that they're either so excited, or or that they're so nervous, right?
Oh,
That they're
right.
like, "Okay, let me gather as much information as possible and, like, lock this down."
Yeah.
And so I get because I get this way on other topics, right, that I'm less
Mm.
familiar with. So I get really anxious, and I'm like, "Okay, let's gather as much information as possible." I have a real live person in front of me, and they're gonna tell me everything I need to know. And then I will go and do that, right? And so it is coming
Mhm.
from a very good place. However, the people on the receiving end typically have had these questions on repeat, um,
Right.
particularly when they're coming out. And I had this experience. I get less questions. Obviously, I professionally do this, so when
Right.
it comes to that, I'm more than happy to answer questions. But in my personal life, I still get a few questions, but not as many as at the beginning. However, whether it's anxiety or excitement or any other kind of high energy momentum, that can be a lot for somebody to manage on the other side. And
Mhm.
typically, it's not something that somebody needs in order to proceed with the interaction. Like they
Right.
think they need to know it, but it's actually not necessary. And so it's just really having people think thoughtfully about their questions and where they're coming from, why they want to know, what they're going to do with that information after the fact. Will it actually improve the interaction, or is it just additional piece of information that might not really yield a lot of value? And the other
Mhm.
thing is, can I get this somewhere else, right? Is kind of over relying on, especially just one person, which typically is the case. Most people don't really meet that many trans and non-binary folks
Right.
unless they're in the community. But over relying on one person, can you go somewhere else with that? And then that shifts the dynamic, and people can, the trans and non-binary person can kind of relax, and actually that's when they tend to then feel more comfortable to share
Mhm.
at their own pace, at their own time. And especially if it's about developing a closer relationship, they might pepper in their experiences as they're talking about their lives, right? So you kind of get it more organically than
Right.
in this like high pressure, like let's go data download in less less than 60 seconds,
Right.
um, so that's more of the shift that can happen when there's a little bit more space provided.
Mhm.
So it's not saying no questions ever, it's just thinking it through.
Mhm.
What is it that I'm asking for? Why do I need it? What am I going to do with it? Will this actually improve things? Maybe even reading the cues of the person you're asking or about to ask. Are they typically wanting to answer questions, or are they a bit more shy? So there's like
Mhm.
a whole bunch of things that can be thought through more carefully, to be in better relationship with trans and non-binary folks.
You've said something once to me before about working, some work that you did with Transfocus, and how um, a question you got asked was something like, well, am I supposed to pretend to be blind then? Or am I supposed to pretend I don't notice
Mhm.
something? Can you talk about that, and how there is that difference between just because you notice something doesn't mean you actually have to comment on it?
Yeah, it was an interesting comment, where I appreciated that somebody wanted to understand better and
Hmm.
were maybe, I mean, I might be inferring, but maybe a bit frustrated
Right.
that they couldn't, in certain circumstances, know more. And part of it was that, you know, how somebody appears might be different from how we expect, based on societal standards. And so the person was like, well, are you expecting me not to see things, right? And that is not the case. Like, we can observe all kinds of things, and we do, right? On this topic, other topics. And so it's not a matter of saying don't see the things. It's just more that there's a moment of pause to see if we need to say something about that, or to ask questions, or to inquire. Usually, sometimes, especially with strong societal expectations for how somebody should look, there
Hmm.
often people are wanting to get clarity. Is this a cisgender person who's expressing themselves in a different way, or is this a trans person? Like, what's going on? And they might, again, back to the insistence, be really kind of anxiously wanting to know that in order to
Hmm.
figure out how to proceed. So it's not that you're not going to notice that. It's okay to notice, but then it's just thinking about, okay, do I need to vocalize anything? Is there anything urgent happening here? And I appreciate people want to avoid mistakes, right? They don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to hurt anybody on the other end. So all
Hmm.
of that, again, coming from a good intention, or a position of good intention, but then just thinking about the other side of the equation of the person receiving the question, the comments, the statements, and whatnot. So it's
Hmm.
just completing that assessment before jumping into things. um, and sometimes people think, or at least I get the impression, that this is like a fast-paced thing, but actually there's a lot more time that you can get with pausing and just
Hmm.
observing a little bit more, before jumping in, right, with a question or assumption, or whatnot. So I would very much invite people to explore pausing and observing, and kind of absorbing a little bit more before taking action. Now, that's easier said than done in this very action oriented, especially North American context, right? So I appreciate that people want to kind of jump in and are almost primed for that, but there is value in that. Just, sitting back for a bit. Yeah.
Hmm. We have a note about you having an experience about this in Colorado, about being told that someone doesn't agree with being queer. And
Oh,
you were
right.
just like, well, like I am. So what do I do?
To that
um,
point,
yeah.
I at work, we all have different belief structures that we align with, ways of living, or even world visions might be very different, right?
Hmm.
And so I can appreciate that, there are some folks who have a harder time understanding queer and trans people or identities. And, it might not align with their view of like their religious beliefs, or, their other types of understanding of the world. And so in that case, sometimes people want to make that very clear to the queer and trans person, or they feel like an obligation to state that in some way. And I've had that not just once, but a few times in
Hmm.
my life, Colorado being one example. And back when I was there, I don't know, a few decades ago, it was a little bit more conservative, and especially the area I was in, there or industry even, um, I had religious coworkers, and in this instance that I'm thinking about, this person wanted to make it very clear that they were against, you know, the state getting involved in marriage, for queer people to be together legally, and also that they were against trans people. And so it's very jarring to hear that from someone else. It doesn't create a lot of safety or a sense of safety, even a sense of belonging. And I don't even think that person was necessarily coming from a malicious standpoint.
Hmm.
They didn't deliver it in a hostile way. It was more just like, "Hey, FYI," It's like, well, I mean, what do I do with that information, right?
Right.
Like, okay, I hear you, and like, so it just became a very difficult situation because I very much enjoyed this person's company, right?
Hmm.
And then by having to state this out loud to me, I I just didn't know how to proceed and didn't feel
Hmm.
very safe with them after that. And I don't think that
Right.
was their intention. I think they were maybe defending or clarifying, or I don't know exactly their rationale, but that's some of the dynamic that could come up in the workplace where people have a belief that they feel like they need to state, when in fact you don't need to state it, and you can still hold it, right? I
Hmm.
mean, the thing is, the workplace is not there to change people's beliefs, but it
Right.
is helpful to respectfully interact with one another. And you don't need to become best buds with
Right. Yeah.
everyone. But yeah, so those are some of the dynamics that I've experienced, and some kind of advice that I would have for folks who feel inclined to do that.
Right. So, like, you're not attending work in order to either have your mind changed or to have your curiosity quenched, or
Mhm. Yeah,
like you're just all there to get on with what you're doing. And that
yeah.
can be
Or
done in
or
a respectful
making
way.
official statements somehow,
Hmm.
right? Because yeah, that can have an impact on a negative impact on folks, even if it wasn't intended.
Hmm. The last question I have, really, or I don't know if it's a question, more of a just a muddled thought that
Hmm.
is going to head your way,
Okay,
is
excellent.
that some cisgender people uh, can feel quite uncomfortable about trans people sharing information if they're, let's say, for example, they're coming out and they are feeling like they're wanting to share
Mhm,
certain aspects about that. Um, yeah, I kind of wanted to know if you could go into that a little more,
mhm.
if you're not comfortable with the way the conversation's going as a cis person.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we've talked about different sides of these interactions, and one of them being about respecting trans and non-binary people's desire to share as much or as little about themselves. But I do want to address the other side of that equation, the receiving of the information from the trans person. And some people are super interested and want to learn more and are open to talking about most things.
Hmm.
And there are some folks who are not comfortable. And I also want to respect and acknowledge that. So sometimes people feel like if it's a minority group or a marginalized group, they have to listen and, feel almost compelled or somehow pressured to do so. And I will say that that's not the case. Like, if you don't want to have that conversation, it's okay to say, I don't, want to talk about this topic. What about talking about this topic? So,
Hmm.
offering other options. So it's not shutting the conversation down and saying you don't want to talk about anything. It's more just like, what are you more comfortable with? And the
Right.
reason I state that is because for some, talking about gender affirming care may not be their cup of tea, right?
Hmm.
Some trans and non-binary folks are super excited about whatever procedures they've chosen for themselves, and some will want to talk to coworkers about it, although not everyone. So just clarifying that.
Hmm.
But also, I appreciate that cis folks, but also maybe even fellow trans people themselves, may not want to talk about those things. And it's okay to decline to talk about things. Of course, we can do it in a gracious way. We're not
Right.
like, ew, like, why are you talking about
Right.
this? But we're just like, hey, just to let you know, I'd rather not talk about that, but I am keen to hear if you want to share about X, Y, and Z, right? So
Hmm.
you're helping kind of shape the conversation, and of course that goes to any topic, right? This is not
Right.
specific to trans and or special to trans and non-binary folks. Using the same matter of fact tone of how you would redirect a conversation on any topic that you want to talk about is the kind of style of approach.
Hmm. Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to? Have we missed anything when it comes to, yeah, asking personal questions at work?
Yeah, there's one other thing that I wanted to add into the mix, and this comes up occasionally, although not as often as people asking too many questions, is that some trans and non-binary folks sometimes say, "Oh, I wish people would take interest in," right? And so,
Mm.
and they find that there's like a deafening silence, or for them,
Hmm.
it feels like a silence on this topic. And I think some people are just trying to be respectful by not asking a
Yeah.
lot of questions. And so I think there is something about, we're not saying no questions ever, shut it down, at work. It's more just like being in tune with the person you're talking with. Of course, that's general advice, not just for trans and
Right.
non-binary folks, but like
Hmm.
generally, if we could be attuned to each person and where they lie on a spectrum of like maybe less sharing about themselves at work versus open to sharing about themselves, and then aligning also with your what you want to know, that can work out a lot better. And so it's okay to ask questions, but it's good to have a bit of a moment of checking in with yourself before asking the question.
Hmm.
And there is time to do that too, right? Especially as you get to know somebody, those things might come up organically, and in which
Right.
case it is helpful, especially if they come up prompted by the trans person, who starts sharing about how they came to terms with the fact that they're trans. Then you asking a follow-up question shows interest, and
Right.
right. So I think it is important that that happen,
Hmm.
and especially if a trans person has stepped into that space. So I think it's just thinking about it from that piece of um, how you're relating to that person, how closely you are connected to them at work, and that will help guide some of those decisions along the way. So hopefully that's helpful for folks, and they feel more confident to step in when there's a desire on the other end to share.
Hmm. Amazing. Thank you so much, Kai. I think that
Mhm.
will be pretty useful. I think that's one of the things that people are really like, oh, I have all these questions I really want to know, but I don't know what to do.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
well, at least that's what I notice.
Well, and that's where you'll get many of the questions on this podcast too, right? We're trying to help people with some of those questions, obviously not specific to an individual, but
Hmm.
just more generally to say, oh, these things might be at play. That helps
Hmm.
people have information in their background, so that they have satisfied their curiosity. Also, of course, there's things like YouTube where tons of
Right.
trans and non-binary folks are sharing their stories in like pretty detailed format. So you
Hmm.
can get a
Thank
lot of
goodness.
answers.
I feel like I feel like that it's one of those things that were like, I don't know. I have probably thought every single one of those questions at some point in my life. And I feel
yeah.
like you're allowed to think it, like you're
Yeah.
allowed to have the questions and
Sure.
you are allowed to seek out answers. It's just
Mm.
knowing where to do that and how to do that and with whom.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect way of summarizing it.
Oh, great. Sweet. Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you as well. It was good to talk this through, and hopefully it's helpful for folks who are listening.
Sweet. See you later.
All right, bye for now.